When considering what theology is versus other disciplines, it's important to look at it etymologically. That is, to look at the origin of the word by looking at its roots. The origin of the word theology stems from the Greek word theologia, and the roots of that word are theos, which means God, and logos, which means words about. Now, the challenge here is that in typical studies, so whether it's biology or geology or physiology, whenever we see that ology at the end of a word, which comes from the same Greek root, logos, we tend to think about that as the study of that something. So in the case of biology, it's going to be the study of living matter, the study of bios. However, in theology, that way of translating these roots doesn't work. And the reason why is because if you really stop to think about it, we cannot actually study God. God is not a thing that we can put under a microscope, that we can scrutinize, that we can measure and weigh. Instead, what we have is all of the different expressions of how God has been spoken about. And as a result, we don't actually have an objective study of God. What we have is what people have said to be their experience. And so we can objectively study what people have said to be their experience of God, but we cannot directly study God. That brings us to the next important point about the nature of theology, and that is theology is a science. That is, it is like all those other disciplines that involves a knowing and it involves a method. It stems from the Latin root scientia. But the kind of science that it is known as a speculative science, and that is versus an empirical science. When I mentioned biology and physiology and geology and many, many other sciences before, those all fell under a certain category known as empirical, and that means that you actually experience what you are studying with your senses. So you measure, you weigh it, you look at it, you can say that it is this and not that. However, in theology, again, we're not able to put God under a microscope, so instead what we have are our rational powers. We use our intellect to be able to see what it is that people have said about God. We can actually say quite objectively that people have said, for example, that God is love, and that other groups maybe don't necessarily agree with that. We can say that objectively. However, we don't need to run experiments. This course, as you can see, does not take place in a lab. This course takes place in a classroom because what we're doing is we're using our thoughts, we're using our ideas in order to come up with rational, justifiable conclusions, and in many instances, conclusions that may make some sense rationally, but ultimately that people assent to in faith.